The desert light in Tunisia had a way of turning every airplane into a hard-edged silhouette, as if the sun itself wanted to reveal the truth of each machine. On an April morning in 1943, pilots of the Luftwaffe cruising above the Mediterranean squinted toward the west and saw something that made them chuckle in their oxygen masks: slender twin booms. A deep central nacelle, twin engines gleaming like coins in the merciless sun. "Zwei motorige Ziele," they said over the radio. Two-engined targets, heavy fighters, clumsy, easy meat. For years, German combat schools had drilled the same lesson into their pilots. A fighter had one engine. Two engines belonged to bombers, reconnaissance machines, or ponderous destroyers meant to kill bombers, not fighters. And here came the Americans with machines that looked, to German eyes, like flying contradictions. The first P-38 Lightnings of the 9th Air Force and 12th Air Force climbed in loose formations, glinting, silver against the blue. Many had arrived only weeks before, flown across the Atlantic in stages, island hopping by way of Brazil and West Africa, a journey that would have been unthinkable in the early war years. They were still raw, their pilots young, their squadrons barely blooded. The Germans saw this and laughed. Lieutenant Fritz Detlev of Jagdgeschwader 51 keyed his mic, amused. "Look at them climb. Flying furniture wagons." Another pilot chimed in, "We will send them back to America piece by piece." They dove from above, confident, banking their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs in tight predatory curves, honed over Poland, France, Britain, and the vast Eastern Front. They expected the twin-engined machines to panic, to scatter, to flee, or to wallow like bombers caught alone. But what happened next forced a silence the desert wind could not fill. The first P-38 in their gun sights did not try to turn. It did not attempt to climb in desperation or roll into a defensive spiral. Instead, the American pilot pushed his throttles forward, the turbo superchargers shrieked, and the Lightning pitched the nose down with a predator's purpose. German pilots, used to opponents who tried to climb away or dogfight in panic, found themselves staring at a streak of silver falling like a thrown spear. Then the guns spoke. 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns? No. Not on this American. The Lightning carried something stranger, more concentrated, a battery of 4 50 caliber machine guns and a single 20mm cannon, all packed in the nose. No wing guns, no convergence problems, no guessing angles. Just one fist of fire, aimed like a rifle. A Messerschmitt began to peel off, confident it could dive away. Instead, it vanished into a cloud of debris. The German pilot never fully understood it. One moment he banked into his run, the next his wing separated in a glittering fan of metal shards under a single crossing burst. The Lightning never even tried to follow the turn. It simply rolled level, dove harder, gained speed beyond the comfortable margins German fighters relied on, and pulled out with a hiss of expanding air. Another German, an ace with more than 20 victories, dived after the departing twin. He frowned as the airframe shuddered beneath him. Compressibility, high-speed buffeting. He had pushed too deep into his dive and now fought to pull his nose up, the heavy resistance of aerodynamics clawing at him. When he levelled at last, heart pounding, the Lightning was already a glimmer far ahead, climbing again on a single arc of unstoppable energy. The Americans had problems. Their cockpits froze at altitude, so cold that pilots joked about icicles forming on their eyebrows. Their aircraft shuddered in compressibility dives, noses refusing to lift, until later modifications added dive recovery flaps. In the early months, some Lightnings simply did not come back from high-speed descents. Yet, to the Germans, facing them for the first time, these flaws were invisible. All they saw was something that defied category neither bomber nor interceptor, not a heavy fighter nor a nimble one, but something new. They had laughed. Now they whispered. On that April day over Tunisia, a Staffelkapitän of JG-27, a veteran of the Desert War since Erwin Rommel first surged across the sand, chased one Lightning too far. The American feigned difficulty, momentarily dropping one engine's throttle, trailing a thin wisp of exhaust. The German pilot grinned. A crippled twin? Easy prey. But the Lightning's throttle leapt again, the turbo howled, and suddenly there was not one engine pushing it forward, but two, each with the brute force of American industry behind it. The German pilot realized his mistake too late. The Lightning rotated sharply into a high yo-yo, the maneuver impossible for a struggling twin, unless that twin had been designed from the blueprint up to fight like a single-engined Predator with redundancy. The P-38's nose dipped, briefly revealing its shark-like lines, then its guns tore a seam across the sky. The Messerschmitt caught fire, spun, and disintegrated in the shimmering heat haze below. In later years, German survivors would remember the first time they saw the twin boom shape in their gun sight, and the sudden shock of realizing this target could climb like a bomber, dive like a falcon, and fiendishly survive with one engine out. A few confessed that the Lightning unsettled them more than early Mustangs ever did. It was not its grace that frightened them, it was its logic. Everything about the design implied endurance, reach, and lethality. A machine that had no intention of fighting on German terms. In officers' messes from Sicily to Sardinia, Luftwaffe veterans compared notes. Some still dismissed the American twin, others looked quietly at their drinks and said nothing. They had seen the mistake. They had felt the weight of it. They remembered the silver glint and the roar of twin propellers climbing back toward the sun. A new silhouette had entered the war. Not elegant like a Spitfire, not brutal like a Thunderbolt, something strange, angular, relentless. And soon every German pilot flying over the Mediterranean would learn the same truth. They had laughed at the Lightning only once. After that first day in April, laughter was replaced by calculation, then unease, then respect edged with fear, because the P-38 had revealed its secret. Two engines were not a weakness, they were a trap. The veterans of Jagdgeschwader 27 no longer laughed when they saw twin tails glinting above the haze layer. By midsummer of 1943, the Luftwaffe in the Mediterranean had learned a bitter lesson. The Lightning was not a heavy target to be bullied. It was a hunter that played by different rules. Over Sicily, Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf pilots watched the strange American fight. Fighters escort bombers deeper and deeper, always returning, always hovering over the battlefield like silver hawks. The Lightning did not need to nurse fuel the way their single-engined fighters did. It did not need to break off a fight the moment the fuel warning needle flirted with empty. It simply stayed. The Luftwaffe began calling it der Gabelschwanz-Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. Captain Wilhelm Kuhn of JG-53 first heard the nickname whispered after a mission near Palermo. His men returned shaken, claiming a single P-38 had crippled two fighters and still had ammunition left to rake a column of trucks on the return leg. Kuhn, who had dismissed the twin boomer months earlier, did not mock them. He had seen it too. The Lightning closed distance with a strange persistence, as if it swallowed the horizon with every second of throttle. "It fights like a wolf pack by itself," one pilot muttered in the mess that night. "It does not chase, it herds." Secret lay in design logic the Germans had not expected from Americans. The Lightning was fast not because it was sleek, but because it had two powerful engines feeding turbo superchargers that kept their breath even in thin air. The Lightning could dive without tearing itself apart. It could climb even when damaged. It could nurse home on one engine and still outrun most pursuers. German pilots cursed and marveled in equal measure. This American brute simply refused to die. Yet the Lightning's path to dominance wasn't clean. American pilots wrestled with cold-soaked cockpits, so frigid at altitude that hands stiffened and breath froze into lace along canopy edges. Compressibility struck without mercy, one wrong dive angle, and the nose locked, the controls heavy as iron, the ocean or mountains rushing up with no promise of mercy. Pilots died learning the machine's edges. But the Americans did not stop flying it, they fixed it. They worked fast. Dive recovery flaps appeared. Heater systems improved. Training manuals expanded. Mistakes turned into doctrine, and doctrine turned into advantage. The Luftwaffe noticed. In the autumn skies over Italy, the first carefully planned German traps turned into funerals. A flight of Messerschmitt Bf-109s attempted a vertical engagement over Salerno, expecting to force the Lightnings into a stall climb. Instead, the P-38s rose with cold confidence, leveled, then slid into shallow dives, converting height into raw velocity. German pilots tried to tighten the circle. The Americans refused. They struck, climbed, reset, struck again. Boom and zoom, the Americans called it. The Germans called it murder at altitude. One engagement became legend among German and American airmen alike. A swarm of 4 Lightnings intercepted 8 Focke-Wulfs near Naples. The Germans dove first old instincts. They expected panic. Instead, the twin-boom silhouettes fanned, then turned inward like the jaws of a trap closing. The nose guns spoke in short, disciplined bursts. One Focke-Wulf disintegrated before its pilot finished his first turn. A second burst into flame. The survivors attempted to climb away. The Lightnings climbed with them. When the fight ended, 3 German pilots returned. One swore he would never again underestimate the American fighter. It was like fighting 2 fighters tied together by lightning, he wrote in his diary. Always one engine ready to strike when the other seemed finished. Even Japanese observers later remarked on the shock expressed by their German counterparts. The Luftwaffe had believed the twin-engine concept doomed in a dogfight. Now they faced a machine that disproved the gospel of lightweight maneuver. The Lightning did not turn tighter. It did not roll faster. It simply refused to play the game. It ruled where oxygen thinned and speed became a weapon of faith. By late 1943, German pilots in Italy whispered brief warnings before takeoff. If you see 2 tails, climb or dive immediately. Do not engage on equal terms. It chooses the fight. The mockery died completely when Staffel reports confirmed what few had wanted to say aloud. Sometimes the fork-tailed devils flew in pairs, and if you chased one, its brother was already falling out of the sun behind you, a twin that hunted like a lone wolf and then called its pack. The laughter of April was gone. In its place came calculation, then wariness, then the first tremor of dread that would echo later in the Pacific sky. The Lightning had shown its strength in the desert and above the Mediterranean. Soon it would deliver a message across the world, the sound of twin Allison engines carrying the most ambitious interception mission of the war. The Germans had stopped laughing. Next, even the Japanese would learn what happened when the fork-tailed devil chose its prey. The Mediterranean was where German laughter died. The Pacific was where silence turned into fear. Spring on Guadalcanal did not bring flowers. It brought rain, heat thick enough to chew, and the whine of insects that drowned thought. The jungle steamed, ammunition rusted overnight, and engines sweated oil like beasts trying to breathe. Into this furnace came the same strange silhouette that had startled the Luftwaffe months earlier. Twin booms, central pod, twin propellers beating the air like war drums. But here, in the South Pacific, no one laughed at the P-38. Men did not laugh on Guadalcanal. They survived. American ground crews worked in the mud, shirts soaked, wiping sweat off olive-drab wings with oil-stained rags. The Lightning's aluminum skin drank heat until mechanics burned their palms. Pilots in sweat-drenched flight suits walked toward their machines, with canteens half empty and eyes already red from fuel fumes and jungle malaria pills. Where German aces once mocked twin engines, Japanese pilots already told ghost stories. They called the P-38 Nikai no Oni, the twin-tailed demon. When the first Lightnings arrived in the Solomons, the Americans were desperate. Guadalcanal had been held by grit and bayonet. Marine fighters had flown from crushed coral strips scraped out of jungle by Navy Seabees under artillery fire. P-39s and P-40s struggled to meet sleek Mitsubishi Zeros in the vertical. Pilots fought like knife fighters in a room too small to swing elbows. But the Lightning did not enter knife fights. It brought a rifle to a duel of knives. At altitude high where Zeros gasped, where Japanese engines lost breath, the P-38 carved air into advantage. It climbed beyond reach. It outran retreat. It dictated terms like a duelist who always controlled the sun on his shoulder. The very sight of its twin tails at 20,000 feet told Japanese pilots the sky now had rules they did not write. Captain Thomas "Tommy" Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron remembered the first true test. A formation of Zeros rose like silver fish leaping toward a hunter. The Americans did not turn to meet them. They did not spiral defensively. Lynch raised 2 fingers, a signal understood instantly among lightning pilots. Energy first, angle second, kill third. The Zeros arrived in a perfect climbing intercept. The Lightnings simply climbed higher. Allison turbochargers howled. The Zeros fell away helplessly, wings fluttering in thin air. The Americans did not pursue, not yet. They waited. High over jungle and ocean, patience was a blade sharper than speed. Then came the roll, the dive, the sudden arrival of death. A single burst, only seconds, tore through a Zero's cockpit. It sheared apart like rice paper in wind. No wing cannons to converge, no guessing lead. One pull of the trigger, and all 5 barrels sang in perfect unison. A Japanese pilot later wrote in his diary, "Recovered after the war. They strike like hawks falling from a mountain cloud. One burst, and a plane disappears. It is not combat, it is judgment." Still, the Lightning demanded respect even from those who flew it. Compressibility stalked every deep dive. Pilots trained in the States learned in the Solomons that nature did not negotiate. Those who forgot were swallowed by ocean or jungle. But American engineers solved problems as quickly as pilots discovered them. Dive flaps came, cockpit heaters improved, doctrine hardened like steel quenched in oil. And something else happened, something the Japanese intelligence officers studying wreckage and reports never fully understood. Range became a weapon. Zeros danced above islands. Lightnings ruled oceans between them. A sortie from Henderson Field reached hundreds of miles past Bougainville, past Buka, into skies the enemy assumed safe. Pilots returned with empty canteens, salt, sweat drying on their lips, sometimes gliding the last miles on vapors, but they returned. Major Richard Bong, still early in the climb toward becoming America's deadliest ace, learned something the Luftwaffe had learned the hard way. The twin engines did more than provide power. They gave a pilot confidence. They gave him time. A Zero could not afford a mistake. A Lightning could survive one, sometimes even 2. In ready tents made of canvas and mildew, pilots joked grimly, "One engine to get you home, the other to bring hell before you go." The Pacific had no patience for romance. It respected results. And the Lightning delivered them. By autumn, Japanese scouts radioed warnings before every major engagement. 2 tails in the sun, be cautious. But caution cannot save a man whose enemy owns altitude, reach, and surprise. And in a humid tent under a dim bulb, intelligence officers of the 13th Air Force studied one mission in planning a mission so audacious it bordered on myth. Orders sealed. Radio procedures rehearsed. Fuel tanks checked twice. This would be no ordinary intercept. This would be a message, carved in gunfire and metal. Somewhere far across the Pacific, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, planned to visit forward bases. He believed the jungle and ocean would shield him. The Americans had Lightning, twin engines, twin tails, a weapon built for reach, patience, and impossible distance. Soon, the world would learn that even an empire's most guarded secret flight path meant nothing when the fork-tailed devil decided to hunt. And the trap once laughed at over Tunisia was about to spring across the Pacific sky. The briefing tent smelled of fuel, sea air, and tension. Maps covered the table, corners pinned by 50 caliber rounds. Intelligence officers whispered. Pilots leaned forward, sweat collecting on brows despite the dawn cool. There were missions, and then there were missions that history bent around. This one bent like iron under a blacksmith's hammer. The voice of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lynch, hard and calm, cut through the murmur. "Gentlemen, we are going to intercept and destroy Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto." There was no gasp, no whispered curse, just a silence so sharp it seemed to slice through canvas walls. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the strategist who had humiliated the U.S. Pacific Fleet. A man revered by his navy, feared by his enemies, respected even by those who hunted him. And the men in the tent had just been ordered to kill him. The intelligence had come in through magic, though no one dared call it that aloud. Cryptanalysts from Station Hypo had broken the Japanese naval cipher. A message intercepted, translated, verified. Yamamoto would leave Rabaul on the morning of April 18, flying south to Bougainville. It listed departure time, aircraft type, escort, route, and landing field, every detail. Such precision made some pilots uneasy. Knowing too much about the enemy felt like seeing fate printed on paper. The Lightning pilots did not question where the information came from, they simply asked for range figures. It was farther than any American fighter had been tasked to strike. Over 400 miles one way. Jungle, ocean, and Japanese-held territory between them and the target. A round trip beyond endurance in any fighter except one. The P-38 Lightning, twin Allison engines, turbo superchargers, long legs where single-engine fighters would wobble and drown. If any machine could reach Yamamoto, it was this one. And so, the mission fell to the fork-tailed devils of the 339th Fighter Squadron, 13th Air Force. 4 Lightnings would attack. 18 more would fly as cover to distract enemy patrols and suggest a routine sweep. Every detail rehearsed, every burst of fuel calculated, engines checked, guns loaded. Pilots sat silent, understanding the magnitude. A strike across vast ocean, guided by math, secrecy, and resolve. Major John W. Mitchell, chosen strike leader, laid out the flight plan. No radios, no deviation. Flying at treetop height over open ocean, where one moment of inattention meant collision with a rising wave. Every man understood that if they faltered, Japanese Zeros would feast on them hundreds of miles from home. "We fly the line," Mitchell said. "Not above it, not below. You lose formation, you die." Before takeoff, a maintenance sergeant tightened the last cowling panel on a Lightning. The pilot, Lieutenant Rex Barber, stood watching. "She'll get you there," the sergeant muttered, wiping sweat and oil from his brow. "And back too." Barber nodded. He hoped so. A single-engine fighter with a fuel leak was a drifting coffin. A Lightning losing one engine was still a knife in the sky. Wheels lifted from Henderson Field just after dawn. 20 P-38s, heavy with fuel, roared down Coral Runway and climbed briefly before dipping back to wave-top height. Ahead lay a vastness that swallowed lesser machines. Trees blurred by. Flying fish scattered, like silver sparks. Hours passed in measured breath and engine vibration. There was no talking, no checking watches. Just the hum of twin propellers and the knowledge that they rode above graves as deep as the Pacific itself. At precisely the appointed moment, 1943 transformed into destiny, the Lightning formation rose through low cloud. Mitchell's voice, quiet but steady, crackled through discipline-tight radio discipline. Bandits at 2 o'clock. Range 5 miles. There they were, 2 Betty bombers, gliding above Bougainville's jungle, accompanied by 6 Zero escorts. Yamamoto's personal transport flew in the lead. Polished, neat, unassuming. Carrying the man who had once gazed at Washington as a naval attaché and predicted that Japan could run wild for 6 months, but beyond that, feared America's industrial storm. Rex Barber eased his throttles. The Lightning's twin engines growled, rising from whisper to thunder. One pass, one moment, one history turning. Barber's sight aligned, his thumb tightened. The nose guns spoke as one deep, shattering bursts of heavy bullets tearing across the bomber's wing, ripping into fuselage and engines. Metal erupted, a plume of black smoke. The Betty faltered, wing dipped, and the jungle rushed up to meet it in violent flame. Admiral Yamamoto never even drew his pistol. He died still holding his gloves. The second bomber tried to escape, diving and twisting. Another Lightning flown by Lieutenant Besby Holmes crippled it. It crash-landed into trees, breaking apart in fire and splinters. A few survivors crawled from wreckage. For the mission target, there would be no return. Jap Zero escorts screamed in, late, furious, but the Lightnings dropped altitude, punching throttles, retreating the same low path they came. Ocean spray kissed wingtips. Carburetors howled under strain. One Lightning failed to return. Others landed nearly dry, engines coughing as tanks ran to fumes. But mission complete. America's message to the Pacific echoed across waves that day. There was no distance too far, no sky too hostile, no admiral untouchable. Word spread through Japanese ranks. Fear followed. Twin tails meant death had traveled oceans to find you. Operation Vengeance was not luck, it was precision, resolution, and a machine built to outrun geography. The Lightning had shown the world what reach truly meant. The fork-tailed devil had crossed the edge of the world and come back. For 2 days after the wreckage cooled in the jungle of Bougainville, no one in the Japanese command dared speak Yamamoto's name aloud. The first search teams found the shattered fuselage buried in mangled palms, aluminum torn like thin paper, smoke still curling from ruptured fuel tanks. Splintered bamboo, torn loam, scorched earth, a scar carved by gravity, war, and inevitability. Under the scorched wings lay the body of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. His gloves remained in his hand. His katana ceremonial, but carried always, was wedged beneath a twisted bench seat. Even in death, he sat upright, strapped into his chair, posture rigid. A clean bullet hole marked his shoulder. A single round, fate, geometry, or destiny had delivered a shot worthy of the greatest marksman of the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya later wrote, "He died as he lived upright, resolute, and facing forward. But the sky he trusted had betrayed him. The Americans owned distance. The escort pilots, shaken and humiliated, returned to Rabaul, carrying a truth heavier than fuel or ammunition. Japan could not protect its most precious leader, not in the air, not at sea, not anywhere the Lightning could fly. At Rabaul's airfield, officers whispered the unthinkable. If the Americans knew Yamamoto's itinerary so precisely, what else did they know? If a squadron of Lightnings could travel across hundreds of miles to strike once and vanish, what sanctuary existed? The Imperial Japanese Navy had survived torpedoes and dive bombers, but confidence, the sacred armor of warriors, began to corrode. Pilots who had glimpsed the ambush described the moment with a simplicity that chilled listeners. 2 tails in the sun, and then fire. Long before formal intelligence confirmed it, word spread across the Pacific. The Americans could strike from anywhere, at any time, with machines that flew farther and struck harder than any Zero. The P-38's twin-boom silhouette became a rumor in jungle outposts, a ghost above shipping lanes, a warning etched into briefing chalkboards. In Japan's naval barracks, flight leaders beat chalk across maps, tracing Yamamoto's doomed route again and again. "How?" cadets asked. The instructors did not answer. They simply drew 2 lines representing twin tails and tapped the board. Fear has no shape, until it does. The Americans celebrated quietly. No parades, no boasting. The men who flew the mission returned to muddy tents, ate powdered eggs, and wiped grime from sweating noses. Some washed their faces in steel helmets filled with rainwater. They did not talk about history. They talked about engine temperatures, fuel mix ratios, ammunition expenditure. War is won not by glory, but by logistics and discipline. Major John Mitchell wrote in his mission log, "The Lightning's endurance delivered this victory. No other fighter in the Pacific could have reached him." The squadrons that launched Operation Vengeance did not crow about vengeance, they sharpened it. They flew the next morning and the next because the ocean was wide and the enemy stubborn. In the officers' mess, quiet toasts lifted tin cups. They remembered Pearl Harbor. Midway. The early months when Allied pilots fought with battered aircraft and hope more than ammunition. But the tone was not triumph. It was inevitability settling into the bones of pilots who had seen the war turn its tide. They had not simply killed Yamamoto. They had killed certainty, Japan's certainty, that distance protected power. In Tokyo, the news reached the highest ranks like a blade through silk. The official communiqué told the public that Yamamoto had died in battle, fighting gallantly to the end. Privately, senior officers recognized a deeper wound. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's loyal chief of staff, wrote in his diary, "We have been outflanked not by courage or cannon, but by mathematics, engines, and codes." Even those steeped in Bushido could not deny that American strength now stretched beyond steel. Yamamoto had once warned the imperial cabinet, "For 6 months we can run wild. After that, I can guarantee nothing." He had been wrong. It lasted closer to 8 months, but the storm he predicted had arrived. It wore olive drab, carried turbocharged Allisons, and bore twin tails like a spear forked by lightning. Post-war interrogations revealed a surprising pattern. Japanese pilots who survived to 1945 rarely mentioned Zeros with reverence. Instead, they spoke of the P-38 with grudging awe. Captain Tadayoshi Koga, who had once scored multiple victories in the Solomons, later wrote, "When we saw one tail, we prepared to fight. When we saw 2, we prayed the ocean would take us quickly." Even in defeat, he remembered the lightning not with hatred, but with respect, the respect one warrior gives another who kills with precision rather than cruelty. After Yamamoto's death, the Japanese changed flight procedures. No senior commander would travel in predictable patterns again. Escorts doubled. Radio silence became doctrine. Yet the shift came too late. The Americans had more lightnings arriving, and more pilots trained not to chase dogfights but to kill objectives. The doctrine of the Pacific had changed. The P-38 was not just a fighter, it was a scalpel, a message, a promise. Twin engines meant reach, twin tails meant intent, and every Japanese officer in the Pacific learned a new truth. In war, courage without range is defeat. When Yamamoto's ashes were carried back to Tokyo under military guard, the ceremony was rich with honor yet heavy with dread. Officers held swords tight, as if bracing against a storm that had already arrived. The Americans did not pause. The lightnings kept flying, escort missions, intercepts, long-range hunts. They stalked shipping lanes, smashed bomber formations, scoured jungle runways. The war still burned, but the direction of flame had shifted. Funeral incense in Tokyo, engine oil in Guadalcanal. 2 worlds, tied by one truth written in sky trails and gunfire. The age of short-legged fighters was over. The Pacific belonged to endurance, reach, and innovation. It belonged to the lightning, and Yamamoto's fate traveled ahead of it like thunder following a flash. War in the Central Pacific did not roar like the Solomons. It pulsed forward in measured thunder. Atolls seized, airfields carved from coral, engineers beating jungle into concrete while Marines dug foxholes in sand still warm from bombardment. It was a war of leapfrogs and runways, of fuel drums stacked like altars, of ocean horizons that seemed infinite until twin silver shapes appeared on them. The P-38 came west not as an experiment now, but as doctrine, not as a question mark, but as an answer. At Tarawa, which smelled of cordite and seawater and sacrifice, pilots walked the airstrip carved from Betio's coral, boots crunching over crushed shell. The Marines had taken the island at terrible cost, and the lightning squadrons arriving afterward saw the price etched into every crater. Lieutenant Charles Mac MacDonald, future ace, already sharp-eyed and calm as a hunter, stepped down from his ladder, stretching legs stiff from the ferry flight. Ahead of him, engineers were still driving bulldozers over wreckage, pushing shattered Japanese bunkers into the sea. The Pacific War, he realized, was not a chessboard. It was a forge. Land was seized not to be held in splendor, but to be paved, fueled, armed, and abandoned once the next island lay ready for conquest. And in that momentum, the lightning thrived. Japan's Zero once ruled Pacific air by turning inside its enemy, but the lightning war of the Central Pacific was not won by turning, it was won by reaching. At 27,000 feet above the azure ocean, a formation of 8 P-38s cut contrails in thin arcs. Below, a convoy of Japanese transports churned toward Malawalap Atoll, guarded by floatplane fighters and torpedo-armed bombers. The Americans did not swoop low immediately. Instead, they climbed, closer to the sun, closer to inevitability. The lead pilot, Captain Newell Roberts of the 340th Squadron, checked his watch. His wingman whispered through radio static, "We'll hit them like they hit Pearl." Roberts didn't reply. He didn't need to. Revenge was no longer emotional, it was procedural. At 7 miles out, he tipped his wing. 8 lightnings rolled inverted and fell. They struck not like birds, but like blades. One burst shredded a floatplane before it could even jettison its drop tank. Another ripped through an escort bomber, its right wing ripping free in a sheet of spray and flame. Japanese gunners swung their cannons skyward, but tracers lagged behind diving phantoms that were already pulling up and climbing away. Boom, zoom, reset, repeat, no dogfight, no swirling ballet, only arithmetic. When the lightnings left, sea foam swallowed burning wreckage, and lifeboats drifted like splinters of broken empire. The convoy never reached the marshals. A Japanese after-action report, later captured and translated, read simply, "Enemy two-tailed fighters descend from great height with terrible speed. They fire as if a waterfall of bullets. They do not stay to fight, only to kill." The Japanese tried to adapt. They stationed Zeros farther out, launched patrols earlier, trained scouts to watch the sky like hawks at dawn. And still the lightnings came, from Tarawa, from Macon, from Kwajalein after its seizure in early 1944. Wherever engineers built fuel dumps and pierced coral for aluminum runways, the fork-tailed devils followed. To Japanese commanders, it felt like fighting ghosts that arrived on ocean wind. Major Saburo Shindo, once bold, now wary, wrote in his diary, "We were taught to see Americans as soft. Yet their machines fly farther, their engines never tire, their bullets never stop. Courage cannot catch a lightning bolt." Distance, once Japan's ally, had turned traitor, the Pacific no longer shielded. It exposed. One mission in December, near Mille Atoll, proved this truth in flesh and aluminum. Lieutenant Tex O'Neill caught a burst of anti-aircraft fire climbing through broken clouds. One engine smoked, shuddered, then seized with a metallic scream. Any other fighter would have spiraled into the sea. Tex stayed level, feathered the prop, trimmed, watched his wingman close in beside him. "Go home," his wingman signaled. Tex shook his head. Not yet. He remained high, circling, waiting. A Japanese reconnaissance plane eventually appeared, a white speck shimmering against blue. Tex dropped. Single engine, wounded plane, war still burning behind his eyes, and the lightning still killed with one pull. Only then did he turn east, alone over hundreds of miles, nursing wounded machinery home over black waves and whitecaps. He landed with fumes in his tank and shell fragments in his wings. Mechanics counted holes. Pilots counted heartbeats. And the Japanese counted distance as a thing no longer theirs. By early 1944, the lightning no longer needed to prove itself. Its reputation preceded it like thunder. Targets moved at dawn now, or at dusk, or under a tormented cloud, but no Japanese pilot trusted the horizon. Not anymore. The U.S. Army Air Forces classified the P-38 as fighter, interceptor, long-range escort, precision strike aircraft. But to those facing it, the description needed only 5 words. It chooses when you die. And as the Central Pacific burned forward, the marshals next, then the Marianas beyond commanders in Tokyo finally whispered aloud what they once denied. The Americans did not need to meet them in glorious duel. The Americans would arrive silent, distant, inevitable. Twin engines, twin tails, and a war no longer fought on Japan's terms. The Pacific was tilting westward now, like a great slab of ocean sliding toward Tokyo, and the first weight pushing it forward had the shape of a lightning bolt drawn across the sky. Saipan smelled of salt, cordite, and new earth ripped open by bulldozers. The Marines had taken the island yard by yard, clearing caves with flamethrowers and hand grenades. Now, engineers paved the future over battlefield dead coral compacted beneath tire rollers, pierced by the rising skeletons of fuel towers and towering hangars. From this volcanic arch of islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, America, planned to reach the Japanese homeland itself. But the road to Tokyo did not lie only in giant Bombay doors. It also lay in the sleek silver wings parked at the edge of the runway, twin tails catching dawn light like blades. The P-38 had arrived to escort the future. By mid-1944, the Pacific was no longer a war of small atolls and jungle strips. Now it was a war of distance measured in thousands of miles, a war of airfields carved from black volcanic rock and oceans choked with ships. And at the center of this new strategy stood the B-29 Superfortress, a machine so vast that pilots called it a city with wings. Its 4 roaring engines could cross the ocean and lay fire on Japan. But even a city needed sentinels. Those guardians wore twin tails. Where Zeros once danced, now the air trembled to deeper thunder. The Lightning's turbo-superchargers sang at altitude, pushing pilots into icy altitudes where oxygen masks frosted and engine oil thickened like winter grease. Here, above 30,000 feet, the P-38's strengths sharpened. Cold engines liked cold skies. Machine guns lined nose like a scalpel. And range, the war-winning kind, flowed in fuel lines like lifeblood. Mission briefings now spoke in continents, not islands. Captain MacDonald, promoted, hardened, visor glinting, briefed his squadron. "We don't fight for airfields now. We fight for cities we haven't seen yet." Tokyo lay 2,000 miles away, but its shadow reached the Marianas. August heat shimmered on Saipan when radar picked up patrol flights approaching the Marianas. Japanese reconnaissance planes came probing, hoping to photograph new American airfields. They came, low at first, then higher, cautious but curious. Lightnings rose to meet them. One such intercept happened on a morning when wind smelled faintly of diesel and wet coral. Lieutenant Harry Slim, Walker throttled up, wheels lifting. His squadron climbed through scattered cloud until they caught sight of a Kawasaki Ki 45 Nick, twin-engine, fast, proud symbol of Japanese long-range capability. Only now, roles reversed. The Nick's pilot, Lieutenant Takahiko Noguchi, later recorded in post-war notes, "I saw 2 white contrails, parallel. I knew them 2 tails. I did not think they could reach this far. I was wrong." Walker slid behind him with surgical calm. The Lightning's nose dipped, guns spoke, and the Japanese twin-engine fighter disintegrated into glittering shards over blue Pacific. The escort war had begun. When the first B-29 missions launched from Saipan toward the Philippines and Formosa, Lightnings flew with them. Heavy bombers, droned like iron leviathans in the sky, engines beating a rhythm older than fear. But beyond bomber wings, like wolves outrunning the herd, P-38s prowled. They flew ahead, above, behind, silent when they could, violent when they must. Japanese interceptors, Tojos, Oscars, Zeros, still lingering like ghosts, rose to challenge the bombers. But unlike the early days of the Pacific, the bombers were not alone, not easy prey. They had guardians. In one engagement over Formosa, 20 Lightnings tangled with over 40 Japanese fighters. The fight did not twist downward into dogfight chaos. Lightning pilots learned the German and Japanese lessons well. Control altitude, strike once, withdraw vertical, return like hammer on anvil. A Zero burst into flame under a hail of .50 caliber fury. Another snapped its wing root and spiraled down trailing smoke. A veteran Japanese pilot, Commander Fujita, later told interrogators, "We trained once to fear single-engined fighters. This 2-engined one became our grief. It came not only to fight, it came to escort destruction. Airfields like Clark in the Philippines once echoed with imperial confidence. Now, American lightnings chopped through raiding formations like butcher knives through silk. Japanese pilots who once believed America soft, indulgent, dependent on machine over spirit now whispered a different fear. That American machines did not tire, that they climbed forever, that they returned even when wounded, trailing smoke over ocean like wounded sharks that refused to sink. And then came the autumn missions over Japan proper escorting reconnaissance B-29s gathering data for the fire raids to come, weather ships, mapping flights, psychological warfare by silence. Japanese lookouts scanning the stratosphere saw them first faint glimmers, twin tails shimmering above contrail line. Not bombers, not scouts, but hunters. And what terrified them most, the Americans, came this, far not once, not twice, but as routine. By early 1945, the P-38 began sharing sky with the sleeker P-51 Mustang, and thunderbolts still roared in lower skies. The Lightning did not retire, it evolved. It strafed convoys along Japanese coasts. It hunted trains from Hokkaido to Kyushu. It dove like a falling star upon radar stations and fuel depots. The Mustang became symbol, but the Lightning remained reach. A Japanese fighter officer summed it simply at war's end. The Americans sent different fighters for different tasks, but the P-38 was the one we feared arriving where it should not be. The Empire's horizon shrank each week. The twin-engine fighter that German pilots once mocked, that Japanese pilots first underestimated, now carved sky above Japan itself. Distance had betrayed Tokyo, and range cold as steel, silent as frost, had become the deadliest weapon of the war. The jungle did not roar at once, it whispered first. Leaves trembled under rotor wash of the approaching storm, not helicopters, but piston thunder rolling low across tree lines, the sound of twin engines beating air like war drums. The P-38 had come south again, not as a dueling interceptor, not as a high-altitude guardian, but as a new creature entirely, a jungle hunter, a convoy butcher, a train yard wraith with cannons in its nose and fuel in its veins. In New Guinea, the Philippines, and the coral strip outposts where engineers carved runways from banyan and volcanic ash, the Lightning shed the last illusions of being merely a fighter. It became punishment, with wings, steel and lead hunting supply lines, radar nodes, trucks, and troop columns, with the hunger of a machine that learned war by attrition. The air war here did not look like Europe. There were no contrails streaking white across sky, no alpine duels at 30,000 feet. Instead, there was heat-thick, choking jungle breath, the taste of mangrove swamp in oxygen masks. Steam rising from aircraft skin at dawn briefings. Pilots stepped from briefing tents into air heavy enough to drown in. Sweat caught in flight jackets before engines turned over. They were told to find the enemy everywhere, and nowhere. By late 1944, the Japanese Empire still possessed spirit, courage, and cunning, but fuel, aircraft, and experienced aviators were dying species. Ammunition came in trickles. Engines failed for want of spare parts. Pilots launched sometimes knowing they could not land for lack of fuel, yet their deadliest weapon's stubborn resolve had not dimmed. American airfields at Tacloban, Dulag, and Mindoro vibrated nightly as Lightning's warmed engines in paired thunder. Their mission logs tell the story, sweeping coastal shipping, strafing barge lines, bringing food to isolated garrisons, hammering bridges and rail depots, feeding Luzon's defenders. Where Japanese radar stations blinked to life, they died, under sudden bursts of 50 caliber fire, towers folding like matchsticks. The Lightning crews called it garden work not out of disrespect, but because it became habitual, cultivated like a grim, precise craft. Plant fire, reap destruction, move. One pilot wrote home, "The jungle below us does not end, neither does our work. The enemy hides in the green, so we turn the green into fire." The Pacific birthed innovation born of desperation. Japanese shipping moved at night and hid by day in coves, under camouflaged nets, or disguised as fishing craft. So American pilots learned a farmer's technique applied to steel and saltwater, skip bombing. A P-38 would swoop low, near mast height, release a bomb timed to skip across waves like a stone, a trick perfected first by Martin B-25s, but mastered now by twin-boom hunters. The bomb would slam into hull and detonate, often splitting barges clean in two. Witnesses said water leapt higher than palm trees, and a Australian coast watcher remembered, "When the lightnings came, the sea itself turned predator. Barges tried to run into mangroves, but those twin engines hunted them like hounds." Japanese barge columns that once ferried men and ammunition across island channels now became grave markers, silent, blackened husks half sunken in tidal mud. Once, the Zero ruled these skies. Now, young Japanese pilots launched knowing the American fighter could outrun, outclimb, outdive, and most bitterly outlast them. The Lightning no longer needed to dogfight. Every engagement became ambush and execution. Gun camera film showed it again and again. A lightning diving out of cloud, 2 short bursts. A white plume of flame trailing from a Zero's nose, a parachute rarely opening. Imperial pilots who survived spoke with awe and dread. 1. Lieutenant Hiroshi Kaneko, grounded by wounds, said later in interrogation, "When we saw the twin tails, we did not think of turning. We thought of fuel, distance, escape." But escape no longer existed. As American troops fought their way through Lete's mud and mosquitoes, P-38s prowled mountains and river valleys in blackwater missions. Flying barely above treetop height, pilots spotted convoys by reflection of sunlight off canteen lids or the flick of canvas tops. Then the jungle erupted. Truck columns burst into flame. Gasoline drums detonated, tossing metal like spearheads through bamboo. Anti-aircraft crews hidden in tree lines fired until the jungle swallowed them, their tracers' arcs swallowed by lightning reply. The Japanese called the P-38 here Ryote Oni, the double-tailed demon. A captured diary from a Japanese infantry captain reads simply, "It comes before we hear it. It shoots before we see it. It leaves only fire." The lightning's bite grew sharper not just from hardware, but from men who had survived enough sky to become predators. They had learned patience the hard way, sweating through jungle humidity and malaria sweats, fighting weather as fierce as any enemy pilot. They spoke differently now, less bravado, more steel. They did not hunt glory, they hunted targets. They no longer chased dogfights, they manufactured outcomes. A 9th Fighter Command debriefing recorded Captain Charles King saying, "Airspeed beats aerobatics, surprise beats courage. 2 engines beat hope." And hope for the Empire was thinning like jungle mist at dawn. By early 1945, the P-38 was not merely a fighter, it was the Pacific's answer to empire. It escorted, scouted, killed supply lines, strangled movement, and burned the war's final bridges. Even as Mustangs arrived, Lightnings kept flying because range mattered, endurance mattered, and twin engines over ocean meant lives saved. When MacArthur returned to Manila, Lightnings buzzed over the ruined capital like watchful hawks. They had carved that return in miles of smoke and steel. A mechanic at Tacloban scratched this into a hangar wall plank. They feared the Zero once. Now the Zero fears the fork-tailed sun. The Lightning had been doubted, mocked, misunderstood. It had been cursed for freezing cockpits and compressibility dives. But in jungle heat and ocean wind, it reached its destiny. It became the thing even veterans whispered about, a machine that did not fatigue, a shadow that crossed whole seas, a predator with patience, and the Empire was running out of air to breathe.